I'm honored and I'm humbled to be here once again. A heartfelt thanks, as ever, to Dr. Lynn Bissonnette-Petrie. Hi. Haven't even had a chance to say hi to you yet. Dr. Thomas Petrie, the Schola, Cantus Angelorum, and all the people who work so hard to make this event the joy that it is. Thank you also to our good bishops who are present. And I'd like to begin again with a show of hands. How many people were at the conference last year in Salem, Oregon? Ooh, nice. Okay. And so I'll ask once again, how many people present normally attend the ordinary form of Mass on most Sundays? Ordinary form for most Sundays. How many people attend the extraordinary form on most Sundays? Slightly more than last year. Okay. All right. So thank you for still being here at this time of day after such a lovely meal. Feels like it's time for a solemn high nap, which for which you would have my blessing. Okay. So Lynn had asked me to give something of like a part two to my presentation last year, Can Canon Law Legislate Transfiguration, with the theme, this time being, Can Canon Law Legislate the Life-Giving Waters of the Eucharist? So it's a complicated question. The answer last year was yes. Thank you, Father Lang. This year, we'll see. We'll see what the answer is. Much of what follows is more of a reflection on law and the nature of law, maybe even the laws of nature. So it's merely some food for thought. I will once again generally not mention exact references as I go to save time, but if anyone has questions about something I say, please do not hesitate to ask me. My ideas are certainly not entirely my own. I am indebted to many wise people and accomplished scholars and experts for their insights. I'm still hoping for a collection of papers from these conferences at some point in the future, which will have all the requisite footnotes for consultation. I must also add this time what I am now required to add, which is that I do not claim to speak for the diocese where I reside and where I work. I'm not a theologian or a scripture scholar. I'm merely a judge serving on a very small tribunal. And so to begin, God always forgives. People sometimes forgive, but nature never forgives. I was in my 40s before I ever heard this. I wish I'd heard it sooner, but it struck me immediately as being true. I trust the truth of it is apparent to you as well. It appears as a true and unalterable law without ever having been promulgated by anyone. It is a good thing when one formally studies law to ponder the nature of law. What is law? Why do we have it? Where does it come from? Who makes laws? Who enforces them? And how laws might change. It is a good thing to know that there is law in the Church, from the divine lawgiver, from the supreme legislator, and then from those who are entrusted with sacramental discipline and the like. Divine law, natural law, ecclesiastical law, and human laws all interact at some level for us in the Church. And of course, the ultimate law in the Church is the salvation of souls and whatever is conducive to that. Both St. Peter and St. Paul exhort us to be good law-abiding members of society. Every society has laws, and the Church, despite many afflictions and problems, is a perfect society. And where one has a society, one has law. Ubi societas, ibi jus. It is good to have some laws as a framework for the various activities and states of life among humans. I'm not in favor of mere legalism or excessive regulation in any area, but some laws are there for a reason. And it's always rather unpleasant to do away with a law that seems unnecessary, only to realize later, in its absence, why it was there. It's one of really the worst experiences in life. In particular, I'm thinking at the moment of the abolition of second instance review for matrimonial nullity cases, which, as far as I'm concerned, is a disaster. So there is a difference, however, between lex and jus, between law in the sense of legal norms and law in the sense of justice or what is just. Not all law, lex, is just, jus. Good laws help to achieve the just. I think we all realize that here in the United States, for example, we have some bad laws which are egregiously unjust. There is more to the Catholic Church's law than what is contained in the 1983 Code of Canon Law. As I mentioned last year, the 1983 Code of Canon Law is only for the Latin Church, as the code itself tells us in Canon number 1. The 23 Eastern Catholic churches in communion with Rome have a Code of Canon Law of their own, the Code of Canons of the Eastern Churches. The 1983 Code of Canon Law, as it says in Canon 2, generally does not address the large body of liturgical law, which is contained mostly in the liturgical books. In Canon 3, we read that it also does not contain the laws pertaining to church-state agreements and concordats that the Holy See has with various countries around the world, nor does it address particular law in the church at the national or local level. There's also the somewhat rarefied area of the Catholic Church's own constitutional law, the Lex Ecclesiae Fundamentalis, which thankfully remains unwritten, like the Constitution of the United Kingdom, and unlike the written Constitution of the United States. Most of the Church's law, however, based as it is on the sacraments, is more or less on the honor system. And regrettably, where there's no honor, there is no system. But even when honor fails, there are two things which can and will ultimately rectify matters. First, the laws of nature cannot be violated without ultimate harm to ourselves. And second, God is merciful, but he is not mocked. In investigating the theme of the conference, the living water of the Eucharist, I had to look into what that meant. What is living water? And beyond that, why do we describe the holy sacrifice as transubstantiated bread and wine as water? Of course, Christ himself describes himself as the living water, just as he also calls himself the living bread, the Eucharist. Of course, when we say the Eucharist is the source and summit of the Church's life, we must mean the Eucharist in the sense of the Eucharistic sacrifice of the Mass, and not merely in the sense of the Blessed Sacrament, detached by itself, because without the Mass, we do not have the Blessed Sacrament. So the best place for me to start, as in most instances when investigating something I do not easily understand, is to look at the opposite. So in this case, dead water. And I immediately thought of the Dead Sea. So warning, that's me in my customary swimwear in the Dead Sea. I know we've just had lunch and all, sorry about that. Always wear your Benedict XVI t-shirt when you go to the Dead Sea. So the Dead Sea is the lowest point on Earth. It's the lowest land point, as there are far greater depths if one considers the bottom of the oceans. The Dead Sea is about 1,400 feet below sea level, and it lies in a stark valley between Israel and Jordan. On the Israeli side that I'm looking at are the caves of Qumran, where the Dead Sea Scrolls were found, and on the Jordanian side, behind me, is Moab and Mount Nebo. You can see it there faintly in the distance, from which Moses saw but did not enter the promised land. As one drives down from Jerusalem, going east, descending through the Judean wilderness, your ears pop from the pressure change, just as they would if you were driving up to 1,400 feet. The water looks good, doesn't it? Although the Dead Sea is much smaller now and is shrinking, mostly due to its main source, the Jordan, being diverted for agricultural purposes in the Jordan Valley, just north of the Dead Sea. But as nice as it looks, if you step into it, you realize it is not like other water. It stings terribly. And if you can bring yourself to wade all the way in, which I couldn't, you simply float on the surface. There's no other choice. It's about 35% salt. The oceans are about 3.5% salt. The Dead Sea does not support life other than a tiny amount of salt-adapted bacteria. Scientists have also been examining an area near the Dead Sea and are finding rocks and other evidence that there was a meteor which exploded upon entry into our atmosphere over that valley about 3,700 years ago. And while the exact location of the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah is still disputed, they were somewhere right around there, it would appear that there was, long ago, an event which saw fire and burning stone fall from the sky in that very area. So that's dead water. Thank you, Mark. Then there are the waters of the great oceans, which are teeming with life, but which water is lethal to us to drink. as our kidneys are unable to process the 3 to 4% salt content of our oceans. Then there are the rivers which feed the oceans, many of which have served us well over the ages, but many of which are polluted. And finally, there are springs. A great prize in the ancient world was to find a good spring, a good source of drinking water, especially in a dry region. One of the best sources of drinking water in the area near the Dead Sea was found, strangely enough, just north of the Dead Sea's northern shore. This spring was identified a long time ago, and it is still producing fresh water. It is the spring that made the city of Jericho possible, and Jericho is usually regarded as the oldest city on earth, the oldest continuously inhabited city, dating to around 11,000 years ago, the end of the last ice age. At the end of the last ice age, which is not that long ago, Earth's climate warmed and ice sheets and glaciers melted. The sea levels rose. There are several accounts, ancient accounts, of a great flood, not just in the Bible, but in the Epic of Gilgamesh and in the Deucalion and other accounts. If our Earth is warming now, it might be the only thing that staves off the next ice age, and there's always a next ice age. Sacred scriptures begin and end by referring to life-giving water. In Genesis chapter 1, we read, "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the abyss, and the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters. And God said, 'Let there be light,' and there was light." In the final chapter of Revelation, chapter 22, we read, "And he showed me a pure river of water of life, clear as crystal, proceeding out of the throne of God and of the Lamb. And whosoever will, let him take the water of life freely." Parenthetically, I would add that water of life is, of course, the old Gaelic term for whiskey, the old aqua vitae, translated into Gaelic as whiskeba. And if the water of life turns out to be Lagavulin or Talisker, I won't complain. And then, of course, we read the account of our Lord meeting the Samaritan woman at the well. Other speakers have already detailed. The sacrifice of the Mass begins with the waters of repentance and salvation, with the asperges or with the viri aquam in the Easter season. The scriptures are filled with beautiful references to the natural world and the cosmos, in particular the Psalms. When we, like the psalmist, look at the natural world, we learn a great deal. Last year, I alluded to the fact that the laws which can and should facilitate the proper celebration of the sacred liturgy need to be taken as seriously as the laws and the rules which govern the arts, for example. In particular, having grown up with piano and ballet, I learned that strict rules had to be followed if one was to play something on the piano that didn't cause people to wince, or if I did not want to wind up on the floor after executing what I thought would be a perfect leap. The arts adhere to very stringent laws to achieve coherence and harmony, and only after an artist has thoroughly mastered particular techniques, the laws and the rules of the arts, does he then have the freedom for his own creativity. As a child, I also routinely accompanied my mother, who was a docent at the San Francisco Zoo, and therefore also learned a wealth about the natural world, the great variety of creatures, and their habitats. So now I'd like to mention two other areas which do have laws and how they might also apply when we're thinking about the laws of the Catholic Church and the Sacred Liturgy. And those two areas are laws pertaining to things which are organic and laws pertaining to the realm of science. And remember, I'm just a canon lawyer, but I've had the great blessing of knowing two exceptional thinkers, one who I hope can join us for a future conference, Dom Alcuin Reed, and one who is no longer with us. That is Father Stanley Yaki. I don't know how many of you are familiar with Father Yaki's work. You are, all right. A great Hungarian theologian and physicist. There's something I read, more on their work just in a moment. There's something I read somewhere on the internet, which I spend too much time on, that got me thinking. Somewhere out there on a so-called traditional blog, and if the traditional movement fails, my friends, it will be because of us, which blog said, quite hyperbolically, the Novus Ordo can make you stupid. Now, this is not true. It's unkind, and if not blasphemous, it's a rather inappropriate thing to say at the very least. There are plenty of bright folks who attend Mass in the Novus Ordo. However, the extraordinary form, or classical Roman rite, certainly can bring a great deal of clarity and insight into why the Church teaches what it has always taught. A patient, observant presence at this ancient public prayer eventually reveals the mysteries of the faith more clearly and more profoundly, both for the laity and for priests alike. I've met many priests at this point who have learned the classical Roman rite, who say that it has transformed their own priesthood greatly and has made many aspects of the Church and its teachings and the spiritual life far more clear. It is truly the logike latreia, the logical or rational worship, which slowly but surely clarifies the truths of the faith to everyone who has eyes to see and ears to hear, as it did for generation after generation of Catholics who, historically, as with the vast majority of humanity, were illiterate and couldn't read. However, to say that it is logical does not necessarily mean that it is identical to our compromised human logic. A scholar might study the classical Roman rite and find therein some things which don't quite make sense. But as with many things organic and in the natural world, some things we don't understand at first eventually become clear to us after some time, especially if there are things where human logic has intervened and has produced truly regrettable results. At the moment, there is a debate about our environment on our planet. But I would also like to mention our liturgical environment. The debate about our environment on our planet pertains to the laws of physics and several subfields in the sciences, which are in the realm of the hard sciences, which deal with, or should only deal with, the strictly quantitative. Additionally, there is a current interest in all things organic. And keep in mind that our food in general, and even more so organic food, is highly regulated by law. The classical Roman rite grew slowly and organically over the centuries, and indeed, Sacrosanctum Concilium 23 insisted that if anything was to be changed in the liturgy of the Roman rite, it was to be done organically. As such, I would like to refer to Dom Alcuin Reid's wonderful book, The Organic Development of the Liturgy. No, I don't often get asked, but once in a while get asked if there are any particular things that we should read because we're in such an immense crisis in the Church. What would really help to read? And there's really not very much out there. There's a handful of books, I think, that really clarify things, and this is one of them. So I heartily recommend it. You don't even have to read it. Don't tell him I said this. Don't read all the way through. I think if you read about halfway through, you'll get it. Anyway. So, and then I will eventually recommend another book, which is, I think, among the few that help to clarify matters. So organic is that which is pertaining to an organism, a living entity, something which exhibits the properties of life and natural growth and development. The classical Roman rite, in addition to the other venerable forms of prayer in the Eastern churches, is something which developed gradually from an original kernel. The principles of organic development in the liturgy are, as explained on, I think it's page 308 of that particular edition, the Ignatius Press edition. Organic development holds openness to growth, prompted by pastoral needs, and continuity with tradition in due proportion. It listens to scholarly desiderata and considers anew the value of liturgical practices lost in the passage of time, drawing upon them to improve the tradition gradually, only if and when this is truly necessary. Ecclesiastical authority supervises this growth. It is not effected at the parish level, at times making prudential judgments about what is apposite in the light of the needs of different ages, but always taking care that liturgical tradition is never impoverished, and that what is handed on is truly that precious heritage received from our fathers, perhaps judiciously pruned and carefully augmented, but not wholly reconstructed, according to the circumstances of the Church in each age, ensuring continuity of belief and of practice. Probably have that tattooed somewhere on myself, just to make it easier. So there are some ancillary principles as well for organic growth, but the progress of technology is a good thing. We are a clever species. Some of our technologies have been so brilliant over the ages, that not only have we not surpassed them, we've forgotten them. Case in point, Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris. We would be utterly unable to construct such a thing in the same way, without electricity, gas engines, and computers. Those things might save it now, thanks be to God, but the original technology, though we have some idea of how things were done, cannot be duplicated. As a result of industrialization, the advent of improvements and fads of improvements took hold of the Western world, and we exported our mania to other places. A byword of the 20th century, when we were not busy killing each other in the millions, was new and improved. The revolution in computer technology has kicked all of this into high gear. I believe, as Pope John Paul II did, that technology is morally neutral. It's what we do with it that makes it good or bad. For example, the only people I've ever known who have had problems with things such as the internet and social media are people who seem to have problems anyway in real life. So, like all the wonderful technologies which can enhance our lives, I like the internet and I like air conditioning, and even my mobile phone is useful once a week or so. Still, there have been multiple alarms raised about how technology of one kind or another is taking over, and how increased internet and telecommunications connectivity has regrettably reduced actual person-to-person connectivity in real life. It seems to be reaching epidemic proportions in the industrialized world, at least. We have moved far away from our organic environment, where our lives and activities were determined by, and of necessity were in harmony with, daylight and hours of darkness, and by the seasons and other natural cycles. Many of our churches and our liturgies suffer, I think, from the use of some technologies, whether it's the excessively bright lights or the celebrant wearing a microphone like a game show host, or whether the place is carpeted to dull the acoustics or the air conditioning drowns out delicate chant. Some technologies are not consonant with the authentic celebration of the liturgy. It's sad to see electric candles in many of our churches instead of votive candles of beeswax. I understand the concern over fire hazards, but at least some of those concerns would be alleviated if we did not have modern priests' vestments which appear to be made of highly combustible material. I haven't seen anything combustible out there yet. Those look good. So, once one moves away from fake materials and amplification and carpet, things actually start to feel a bit different, and things become less and less like someone's tacky living room. The modern celebration of Mass seems to leave little trace in the minds and the hearts of the faithful because much of it is familiar. It's in more or less everyday language, though the translation is much improved thanks to Monsignor Wadsworth and his team. It has, it's beautiful. It has everyday furnishings and materials, and sometimes has the familiar sounds and tunes of a piano and a guitar. The problem of electric amplification is one of the most painful ones for me, as I realized I was hearing that and not my Father's voice. This is even worse when, as is the case with several priests I know who have great singing voices, I wind up hearing them through that, instead of hearing them unmediated, the beautiful gift that God has bestowed on them and which they share with us to God's greater glory. The Church is wise to oblige us at least once a week to meet in the same place with others. It's nice that there's Holy Mass broadcast for the homebound, but unless one is too infirm to attend Mass, merely watching Mass instead of being present is insufficient. And while there are one or two priests I know who I would like to go to confession regularly, even though I live far away from them, a Skype confession is simply an impossibility. Priest and penitent must hear each other viva voce, in each other's presence. Separated by a fixed grill, of course. I'll give you some free legal advice for all of our priests present. Go back to using the old style of the confessional as quickly as you can. Try not to hear anyone's confession face to face. With the current legislative attempts in California and other states, to have you break the inviolable seal of the sacrament and report certain crimes, your only protection might wind up being that you simply could not identify the person who confessed. So. There was a New Yorker article last year which recalled a little-known story by E.M. Forster. I'll read this bit. Much of this, our present alienating technology, remarkably, was envisaged by E.M. Forster in his 1909 story, The Machine Stops, in which he imagined a future where people live underground in isolated cells, never seeing one another and communicating only by audio and visual devices. 1909. Humanity has been overtaken by the machine, which provides all comforts and meets all needs, except the need for human contact. In the story, one young man, Kuno, pleads with his mother via a Skype-like technology. I want to see you, not through the machine. I want to speak to you, not through the wearisome machine. Just as technology can create distance in addition to bringing people together, so too can a new and improved mentality denature things which are organic by nature. We have changed our food in some ways for better, but also for worse in many ways. And we have changed how we live in our relationship to each other and our surroundings a great deal. And in doing so, we have been changed rather a lot, especially our waistlines. Some of the current focus on organic food has to do with eating actual food, rather than something that once was food but has been processed into something else. Although if I'm writing an unusually difficult sentence at the tribunal, do not come between me and my bag of cheesy puffs. So, had a lot of difficult cases this year. So, just as the organic food business seems to be taking off as people grow in awareness of how far we have come from the days of unadulterated food, that small basket of organic blueberries from Chile probably has a larger carbon footprint than anyone in this room. I can only hope that organic liturgy is also something that more and more people turn to or return to. The Roman Rite, which was supposed to have merely undergone some modest reforms, some of which might have been in organic continuity, has also been considerably denatured. It has also, in its present incarnation, almost become more of an extended communion service. I get the sense that most people are at Mass for communion, and I think that in the minds of some of the faithful, Mass somehow doesn't count if one does not receive communion. And that might be why a certain number of people leave right after communion, as if to say, mission accomplished, as if that was the obligation, rather than attendance at Sunday and Holy Day Mass. And because so many people go up to receive, then of course the increased number of people who are not eligible to receive communion due to being, for example, in an irregular union, would feel left out. And I think that's the debate going on in Germany at the moment and other places. Additionally, having shifted the emphasis of the Mass more toward the communal meal or Lord's Supper aspect rather than emphasizing the Mass as a sacrifice, has also made it that if one is present for a meal, then not being able to eat is indeed more of a problem. While the conciliar proposals for reform are relatively modest in scope, the post-conciliar changes went into overdrive to remove what were considered obstacles, like the altar rail and our venerable liturgical language of Latin. But we seem to have put up other obstacles instead, for example, sin. One of the biggest mistakes was to remove the altar rail. It was considered a hindrance. I have a friend who inherited a parish that was entirely carpeted, sort of dying parish red, I call it. And an insurance adjuster came over, and the step up to the sanctuary is very shallow, and he was looking at something up on the ceiling and stepped back a step and stepped back off very awkwardly, almost lost his balance in stepping off of the carpeted, slippery sanctuary step. And the pastor had the presence of mind to say, oh, well, there used to be an altar rail there. And he's like, well, we should put that back right away. So that's how he sold it to his parish council, was that it was being done for insurance purposes. And on a more somber note, if you look at all the priests who have been attacked in the sanctuary over the last couple of years, having an altar rail back in place with the gates closed, I don't know if it'll save your life, but it might give you an extra few seconds to get out of harm's way. So there's another reason. Do it for your own safety. So, yeah, the altar rail was considered a hindrance. Latin was also considered a hindrance. The point seems to have been to get things to flow more freely without these barriers. But even though Mass is available in a great number of vernacular languages, I'm not seeing many indications that people understand what the Mass is any better than before. Additionally, if the main point was to get people's noses out of their hand missiles and have them experience that faith comes by hearing, many people are still glued to the missalettes, even though the liturgy is in their own language. Never forget either that one of the first things a conquering nation does to those it vanquishes is to suppress their language. Destroy the language, and you usually destroy the culture and identity of a people. So, all of this is rather like the efforts to remove perceived obstacles or nuisances in nature. Now, bear with me on this, but given that we're here in the Northwest, I'd like to offer one of the prime examples of the eradication of the work of nature's great ecological engineer, the Castor canadensis, or North American beaver. Can you put up our little furry friend? There you go. Oh, so, all right, stay with me. I know all the ladies in the room would go, oh. So beavers and their dams underwent extirpation and removal to a huge extent over the last 150 years, the point seemingly being to let our rivers flow freely. But now there appears to be momentum gathering to reverse gears and reintroduce them in as many areas as fast as we can. The beaver dams that look like mere accretions or hindrances created beaver meadows and ponds, areas which provided a nutrient-rich habitat for a considerable number of other species, plus served for filtering out pollutants from our rivers and streams. The Wikipedia entry states, the actions of beavers for hundreds of thousands of years in the Northern Hemisphere have kept water systems healthy and in good repair. The beaver works as a keystone species in an ecosystem by creating wetlands that are used by many other species. Next to humans, no other extant animal appears to do more to shape its landscape. Beavers potentially even affect climate change. All right, thanks, Mark. There's a video on YouTube made by a woman who adopted an orphaned beaver pup, just like that little guy. And to her amazement, even though this little critter had no parents to show it what to do, the lady woke up one morning and went into her kitchen, and this adorable fuzzball had created a dam out of the children's shoes and toys and anything else it could get its hands on. So I would say any animal that can do that by instinct, just let it do that. And if there are too many of them, you can cull the population, but just let them do what they're wired to do. And if it happens in your own backyard, chances are it's actually not in your backyard, it's in their backyard. Anyway. So recent years have also seen restoration projects of wetlands and seashores and other areas in our world, especially the habitats of endangered species. Taking a cue from the natural world, I now believe that regarding our sacred liturgy, we can no longer speak of reform or renewal, but must instead look to restoration. Archbishop Gullickson will present a paper on full liturgical restoration at this summer's Sacred Liturgy summer school in August. Law sometimes will create certain obstacles not to achieve a least common denominator, but rather a level playing field. The classical liturgy tends to put one in one's place. Though belonging to the royal priesthood, the individual member of the lay faithful is small and humble, with no special role other than as a beloved child of God, dependent on him for each next breath, not always understanding all of his mysteries or his unfathomable will, but just grateful for being here. And as we've heard many times, lex orandi, lex credendi, lex agendi, lex vivendi. The law of prayer is the law of belief, which is then the law of how one acts, which is then how one lives. Change the law of prayer, and you change how people live. Denature an organic entity like the Sacred Liturgy, and you cannot but change the nature or at least the behavior of those who interact with it. One of the results of our present environment in the Church is that according to a number of statistical studies, secular studies, Catholics are virtually indistinguishable from the surrounding culture and are no longer recognizable as Catholics when it comes to the grave moral issues. In the United States, Catholics have abortions, use artificial contraception, and get divorced and civilly remarried at exactly the same rate as the non-Catholic population. It is as if Christ makes no difference. My own work as a judge bears this out. I have served on several tribunals over the last 10 years, and I think people tell us what they would not even mention in confession. These sad statistics are borne out by my conversations with the people who come to the tribunal, seeking a clarification of their matrimonial status in the eyes of the Catholic Church. And remember, these are the good Catholics. These are the ones who want to do what is right and to be in the good graces of the Church. And although I obviously fully accept the validity of the Novus Ordo, it's the rite that brought me into the Catholic Church, the rather denatured liturgy has also turned out to be a much too easy and undemanding, well, it's like a unisex rite. It's one of the reasons why I think there even is such a thing as what is called the women's ordination movement. I do not think that any of the women involved or interested in the women's ordination movement would ever contemplate celebrating the extraordinary form of the Roman Rite. And the Church certainly would never ask any woman to process into church in hieratic vestments on Good Friday, barefoot, and prostrate herself face down on the floor in penitence in front of all the people. Nor would any woman serving as deacon or subdeacon kiss the celebrant's hand for the solita oscula in the traditional liturgy. So, don't want to cast blame, but I just don't think we'd be where we are now without that. Many of the fads of the new and improved were supposedly undergirded by science, or what passed for science at that time. The various theologies and theological fads and liturgical fads of the 20th century also claimed to have a scientific basis. As Pope Benedict said in his address to the priests gathered for the closure of the year of the priesthood in 2010, I have been following theology since 1946, and therefore I have seen about 3 generations of theologians, and I can say that the hypotheses that in that time, and then in the 1960s and 1980s, were the newest, absolutely scientific, absolutely almost dogmatic, have since aged and are no longer valid. Many of them seem almost ridiculous. So have the courage to resist the apparently scientific approach and do not submit to all the hypotheses of the moment, but really start thinking from the great faith of the Church, which is present in all times and opens for us access to the truth. He continued, we must have the courage to use the great, broader reason, and we must have the humility not to submit to all the hypotheses of the moment and to live by the great faith of the Church of all times. There is no majority against the majority of the saints. So this is also true of science at large. Some theories or hypotheses once promoted as scientific fact have been discredited, which brings us to the question of the Church and science. So I now turn to the work of someone I still miss very much, Father Stanley Yaki. He died 10 years ago. This is the other book I would recommend. Science Was Born of Christianity. It's an ugly bit of, I guess, Enlightenment and Protestant propaganda that the Catholic Church has opposed science. The dominant model of science, which is used around the world today, arose out of Catholic Europe. Other cultures elsewhere in the world produced remarkable scientific achievements, many of which have indeed been adopted and incorporated into the model of science that emerged from Catholic Europe. Modern science emerged in the Middle Ages at the Catholic universities in Europe. The scientific revolution is marked by a change to the mathematical description of nature born of the Catholic Christian worldview that God created everything ordered and good. But part of the regrettable propaganda is that you had the Greeks and then Copernicus and Galileo and nobody in between, when in fact the in-between consisted of century after century of Catholic priest scientists, creating the foundations of the now world-dominating scientific method. The names might not be familiar to you, but if you search the internet for list of Catholic clergy scientists, you will find them, each one either a bishop, priest, or at least a minor cleric. Bishop Nicole Oresme, Jean Buridan, and Albert of Saxony, plus St. Albert the Great, Vitello, Robert Grosseteste, Thomas Bradwardine, Johannes Sacrobosco, Nicholas of Cusa, Theodoric of Freiburg, Roger Bacon, and John Peckham, just to name a few between the year 1000 and 1500. And I like to think that the logica latreia, logical or rational worship, inspired and supported, at least in part, the rationality of these great thinkers. Through the liturgy, which surely formed part of a holistic way of life for them, they got to know the God who, we read in the Book of Wisdom, disposed everything according to measure, weight, and number. While there's no time to go into their individual discoveries and contributions, it is worth picking up that book and then going from there. It will give you enough to study for the rest of your life. And that is a good thing, especially for the clergy present, because you will be challenged on this topic, the church and science, as I'm sure you have been, probably for the rest of your lives. And in particular, I think the Galileo case still looms very large in the public's imagination as an example of how the church allegedly opposed a great scientist. So I would say, learn the Galileo case. And above all, I think remember this. Galileo, like Copernicus before him, of course, was wrong. Heliocentrism was wrong. The sun is not the center of the universe. Our sun is merely the center of our solar system. But that is not what they said. They said center of the cosmos, and that they had proven it as a scientific fact. And despite the wise objections of Cardinal Robert Bellarmine, Saint Robert Bellarmine of the Holy Office, who did not oppose heliocentrism as a hypothesis, but merely did not think Galileo should assert it as a proven fact, since it wasn't, heliocentrism became the settled science of its time and remained such for about the next 140 years or so, until William Herschel took a break from composing symphonies and went out into his backyard with the telescopes that he and his sister Caroline had made and polished themselves and undertook deep sky surveys of the stars, the results of which indicated that our sun was a star among a vast number of stars and most likely was not at the center of the universe, which at that time was believed to consist just of the Milky Way, though there were some questions about the location of the blurry stars or nebulae that were observed. And that view held sway until Edwin Hubble, who less than 100 years ago demonstrated that some of the nebulae were in fact not stars, but entire galaxies outside our own at a truly vast distance. This is only 100 years ago, if that. And wherever we were, we are most certainly not in the center of anything in an expanding universe. After all, the scriptures tell us in multiple places that God stretches out the heavens. If anything, we are in the off the beaten path and unglamorous Nazareth of the universe. Those who do not believe in God sometimes will say that they believe in science. But if you read a science textbook from 50 years ago, you do not even need to have a formal background in science to read therein things which we now view differently. And reading a science textbook from 100 years ago can be downright quaint. So although the scientific method remains valid, science changes all the time, and I don't see how it's possible to base one's beliefs on something that changes all the time. So I'm not calling for ditching nice things like electricity, but many of our supposed scientific advancements have left an unprecedented number of people physically fat, spiritually malnourished, and very much alone. So when the latest scientific theory is applied to our world or ourselves or our faith, just keep in mind these. For example, when someone says that climate change or other current theories are settled science, they might not be quite as settled as all that. We know that the heavens will vanish like smoke and the earth wear out like a garment, but our earth and our climate has changed greatly over the epochs of time. So the facade of the beautiful church of Santa Maria sopra Minerva in Rome shows something of this. The flood markers on the front of the church are from 1422, 1495, 1530, 1557, and the highest one is from 1595. And then there's nothing throughout the 1600s and the 1700s, nor the 1800s until 1870. After that time, the embankments along the Tiber began to be built, but clearly something was very different in the 16th century. For about 100 years, there was a flood every 15 feet at least, every 30 to 35 years, and then nothing. So we don't know. If there is a current warming trend, maybe we will be spared that next ice age a while longer. And regarding human beings, some say that because certain behaviors are found among other species in nature, including some behavior among our closest genetic relatives, which is enough to make even veteran zoologists blush or cause alarm outright, that somehow makes those behaviors acceptable for us. But just because a particular behavior is found in nature does not mean that it is consonant with human nature. And similarly, both outside and within our church, people say that celibacy is unnatural. But human beings, alone among all living species, are the only ones who can choose not to reproduce, can choose to be continent. And therefore, celibacy, far from being unnatural, is instead uniquely and profoundly human. It is time, therefore, to gently but firmly begin to restore our organic liturgical habitat. Where the organically developed liturgy and its liturgical environment has been restored, the living waters flow again in abundance. An abundant new life has grown. Large families with many children and a normal number of vocations to the priesthood and religious life, in addition to works of charity often discounted because they are small-scale and hidden and person-to-person, rather than carried out or dispensed at the institutional level. I do not know if I will see a full restoration in my lifetime, but the much smaller church that is on its way will probably see it. In my travels, I've been to many parishes and have seen many parish bulletins which describe the place as vibrant and spirit-filled. The bulletins at some parishes are 6 or 8 pages long and list 20 or 30 or 40 different ministries on the front cover alone. But I almost always ask the same question of the pastors when I have the chance. How many priestly and religious vocations have come from this parish, or what was the last priestly or religious vocation from the parish? The answer in most places is that no one can remember, and when they can remember, it is usually on the order of 20 or 30 or 40 years ago. It's almost like 1 year for each ministry on the cover of the bulletin. So I would hope that our homes and our remaining churches, properly restored, become places of abundant new life, physical life and spiritual life. During my 5 years of study in Rome, I learned a great deal about sitting through long discourses. When the person speaking would mention Our Lady, I then knew that he was winding down. So now too, I'd like to wind down, but by mentioning Saint Joseph. If the last century was in a way the Marian century, and while we will always beg Our Lady to be our mother, as we confront unknown times, I feel now more than ever that Saint Joseph is the saint for our times. Saint Joseph is an approachable model for all fathers, for all men, really, and given the accelerating crisis in family life, and in particular in the role of men, the silent, dutiful, proactive, and capable Saint Joseph shows all men the way forward. May he intercede for us as we weather the storm ahead, as I believe that we are only at the very beginning of an immense crisis in the church. I don't know if we will succeed in restoring our habitat. I have a feeling we might not, or only in small islands, sort of archipelago church, as Father Yaki described it. Nature will not forgive us, that is certain. But may we forgive each other before the end, and may God forgive us all. In the meantime, each in our own small way, let us do all that we can. Dignum et justum est, it is worthy and it is just. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Magdalene Ross, for your presentation and commentary. I was thinking of Erasmus, his amazing ability to give social commentary with pithy sense of humor, that at the end you can only say, that's not only funny, but it's actually kind of true. And so thank you for that combination of great social commentary and practical historical context in which we find ourselves in. And weaving in so many aspects of human life together to create an analogy for maybe an explanation of why things just simply aren't the way God intended them to be. And perhaps that's linked to the reality that there's divine law, natural law, ecclesial law, and civil law, and those are hopefully helpful when done correctly. But not all law is just, that's certainly true, but good law helps achieve justice. So we continue to pray for all of our government leaders, right? There is kind of a sense of an unwritten foundational law that must be honored, and even canon law is built upon that. So much of that tradition is essential for proper and adequate legal legislation. You drew from quite a few different analogies in the environment, the most popular of which would be the beaver, and the analogy of the movement to restore the environment. Maybe we could move from an idea of renewal to restoration. Maybe as the beaver might be to some ecological systems, I don't know, Gregorian chant could be to the renewal of the liturgy. So if you have a hard time feeling affectionate about Gregorian chant, think of it as your little beaver that's going to save your environment. Yes, there's liturgical. But there is a profound reality that Magdalene brought forward that I think we feel very deeply, and that is there is a certain law, and law has its authority. The way you pray is the way you believe, and the way you act is the way you live. And maybe the way we pray actually does influence the way we live. And perhaps we can come to a realization that we need restoration by starting from the end. Maybe we're not living the way Christ wants us to. And if that's the case, then we're certainly acting the way Christ doesn't want us to. And maybe our belief is not exactly where it needs to be, and that could be related to the way we're praying. Just food for thought. I appreciated that, certainly, laying that out, Magdalene, and it kind of rung a bell for me as a pastor, but then also realizing that this really is important. The restoration of the way the church worships God affects the moral order directly. I also want to thank you for, once again, for your witty and humorous social commentary. And once again, want to bring forward Erasmus as maybe your friend in that adventure. But Magdalene, I want to thank you for the boldness that you have in saying things that sometimes are hard to hear, sometimes make you ostracized, maybe in the minority. And that's not an easy vocation. That's not an easy calling. It's much easier to kind of go with the flow. And so I want to honor that commitment you've made to truly seeking the causes of some of the challenges of the 20th century and building a historical context from which we can critically think about some of the decisions that were made in the 20th century. Some of those decisions, of course, were ecclesial. And your sincere and heartfelt desire for a profound restoration of liturgical law to guide us to the transformation for the correct order of divine law to be the primary law from which we all experience that healing and restoration. So thank you very much.